Okay folks, time for another JLever update and a few comments on some recent Lance Hedrick videos about shaking your grounds and what we've ultimately decided to advise as puck prep for the JLever and the upcoming VFiPP plates. Lance's interesting results on shaking your grounds inspired me to do some extensive testing of my own, and here's what I found. If you're grinding so fine that you're near this fundamental surface tension air locking limit in the diameter of the aperture bypass channels I mentioned in a previous video last year, then homogenizing your grounds by shaking them can even out the flow throughout the puck and hence recover some lost extraction yield. If you're not near this fundamental air locking limit, shaking won't do much and you can grind directly into the basket. So how do you know you're near this air locking limit? The simplest way is to check for dark spots on the bottom of the puck. Let's briefly go through the theory for those interested, as it does provide some insight into espresso extraction. Basically, during an extraction process, we know that there is a gradient in the linear compressive force puck layers experience. The top layers of the puck experience very little compressive force, while the bottom layers experience a lot of compressive force. As a result, the bulk of the flow constriction for a puck takes place in those very bottom layers that cover the basket hole perforations, as it's these layers that are under the highest compression. So the governing factor in the flow rate for any one particular basket hole perforation is the ensemble average of all aperture channel diameters surrounding and feeding the basket hole perforation. Let's call this an effective diameter for ease of reference. If we were to place the effective diameters for all basket hole perforations into histogram bins and plot the sums across the effective diameter size, we'd most likely end up with a bell-shaped distribution like this. Now let's plot a hypothetical flow rate versus effective diameter curve for any one particular effective diameter. We could hypothesize our plot would look something like this. That is, the smaller the effective diameter of the aperture through which you're trying to squeeze water, the slower the flow rate, right? But that's not what happens, at least on the microscopic scale, due to surface tension effects. When those tiny aperture channels become so small that the relative force required to elongate and hence push the air bubble front through the aperture channels is larger than the force available due to water pressure, then at that point, the flow abruptly drops to zero and there is a permanent airlock in that section of the puck. Now that we have this picture, let's look at a couple of examples. If you're pulling a shot over 21 grams with little pre-infusion, you probably won't be near this air locking limit, as those types of shots require a relatively larger grind size. Your distribution for the effective diameter for all basket hole perforations might be located here. So while there might be a slightly different flow rate between basket holes, there will still be a relatively even flow across the puck. As a result, you won't benefit much from shaking your grounds, and you can grind directly into the basket. If on the other hand, you're pulling a dose, say under 19 grams, and you're using a longer pre-infusion time, which allow for very fine grinds, and you're on the clogged side of the extraction yield curve, then your distribution might be positioned here, where some of the basket holes have effective diameters that are in the permanently airlocked part of the curve, and as a result, they won't get any flow whatsoever, and you'll see some dark spots on the bottom of the puck. Here, shaking can help redistribute the fines amongst the boulders, even out the effective diameters, and hence narrow the distribution, in effect pushing some of the holes out of the airlock region, resulting in a 1% approximate extraction yield recovery. Alternatively, you can just grind a little coarser to achieve the same thing. What we found from all tests is that there is an extraction yield peak limit for an even extraction, free from dark spots, shaking or no shaking. If you're near this extraction limit peak, you probably won't see any benefit from shaking. However, irrespective of this limited benefit, from our assessment, shaking your grounds is still a useful process, and it's something that we'll encourage in conjunction with surface WDT. And I'll tell you why. Because of its effects on the entire extraction yield to grind size curve. Namely, while shaking shifts the extraction yield curve to the finer side, it also probably broadens the extraction yield curve, because a more even distribution probably won't hinder the extraction on the other side of the curve. And when you're making espresso and dialing in, you're not always going to be at the high extraction yield peak. You're going to be all over the place on this curve as you dial in to the recommended 25 to 30 second range. This means that on average, across all shots, you'll be drinking slightly higher extraction yield espresso than without shaking, due to the broader extraction yield curve. Anyway, I thought that was a really neat puzzle to solve. I feel we're really coming close to unraveling all the secrets espresso extraction has to offer. Now, regarding WDT versus horizontal tapping, while shaking your grounds is clearly a form of microscopic redistribution of fines amongst the boulders in that critical bottom layer of the puck, WDT is a form of macroscopic puck distribution, aimed purely, in my opinion, at getting the puck to a consistent thickness. Puck thickness governs the amount of compressive force any critical bottom layers experience, which in turn factors into the effective diameter of the previously mentioned aperture channels and basket hole perforations. You can shake all you want and have a perfectly distributed set of fines and boulders in the bottom layer, but if your puck is thinner in one section, then the bottom layers under that section of the puck will experience less linear compressive force and as such will have a larger effective diameter and your flow won't be as even as possible. Again, this is exacerbated if you're near this airlocking limit. Hence both shaking and surface WDT are important for even flow in traditional espresso, especially for high extraction baskets. So we'll be advising to use both. For VFiPP, on the other hand, we can almost drop the WDT work to just a couple of seconds because VFiPP plates provide a consistent linear compressive force across the puck. However, interestingly, they only partly correct for poor microscopic distribution. And now we understand why. So shaking is something that could potentially add a little bit more to VFiPP extractions. That's why we'll be advising to shake your grounds. I also looked at how to shake grounds, and here's what I found. It doesn't really matter whether you use a blind shaker, a dosing cup and cover, or even a glass cup and cover, but don't shake within the basket, because I also found that grounds can stick to the surfaces, and the grounds stuck to these surfaces, especially the bottom of the baskets, are finer than the rest of the bulk of the grounds, which doesn't make for a very well distributed critical bottom layer. From all the tests we did, putting aside taste and just focusing on maximizing extraction yield, there is really only one rule, and this will be the rule for VFiPP plates also. Grind as fine as possible. If you run into dark spots and your distribution is good, grind coarser. That's it. This is probably the golden rule to the best possible espresso, with espresso ratio being chosen for intensity and preferences. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's move on to the JLever updates. First, on the Kickstarter. You know, I'm so glad I didn't do a Kickstarter last year, as I would have had a lot of angry people that would have put down money waiting on me right about now. I simply did not anticipate how long it was going to take to go from a working prototype to a commercially viable manufacturer-ready design. We'll look at a smaller Kickstarter perhaps later on in the year when we're very close to mass production and all risks have been removed for people. So the first question is, should we stop the development of our WDT tool due to the above results? Obviously not. I found horizontal tapping to require some skill and finesse, and it's not as simple or as consistent as just a flick of the WD tool across the surface. Not only that, some people will be pulling 14-gram shots on the 58mm baskets using VFiPP plates, as these plates open up the possibility of such shots, and try horizontally tapping a 14-gram dose perfectly flat, especially if the grounds are very fine and have some humidity to them and hence some clumpiness. So I think our tool is still very useful for people. It's highly configurable with different needle heights. We can do surface puck raking as well as mid-depth WDT, hopefully without deep cuts inside the puck. Moving on to the JLever. Our journey from a working prototype showcased last year to a manufacturer-ready design was not as smooth as we would have liked, and almost took a whole year. Here's an in-depth look at the final design and some of the main challenges we faced. Back in a previous video, I addressed the challenge in designing a force modification mechanism made necessary by the increased force required by the VFiPP plates. Although effective, it still left us with the problem of how to reset the piston to its lower position after the lever arms were pulled back. The neat and somewhat obvious solution we introduced were these high tensile springs, which effectively pulled the piston back to its lowest position when the arms are pulled up. We also put these grooves in the piston pins so that these springs double up as holding clips and prevent the pins from scratching the main cylinder. So I thought that was a really neat fix. However, these springs are one of the few things to be tested with an actual prototype, but we're hopeful the retraction mechanisms should work smoothly. Another major challenge was achieving sufficient leverage without compromising the espresso machine portafilter arms clearance. The main dilemma was this: to increase leverage, a smaller J-curve in the lever arm is necessary, but this reduced clearance between the arms and the top of the machine parts. Conversely, a larger J-curve allowed for the required clearance, but this mandated a smaller cylinder radius to maintain proper leverage, as the height of the J-lever arm pushes the piston too high. However, a smaller cylinder diameter couldn't accommodate the larger arm diameter. After extensive experimentation with various combinations, we finally found a solution, but only just. In fact, the acceptable range for these dimensions was so incredibly narrow that at one point I thought it was not possible and that we had to go back to the drawing board and completely redesign our force modification mechanism so that we could use a larger cylinder. But luckily this was solved. Another issue was the thermal properties of the outer main cover. Tests show that after 3 shots, the unit became uncomfortably hot to the touch. To solve this, we first noticed that there was a temperature gradient in the cylinder, so we only needed to thicken up the top section of the main cover. But overall, we also added an extra outer groove pattern to ensure the unit was still comfortable to hold after a few shots. So we ended up with this really nice slender curve and textured surface for the main cylinder body. The locking means and pressure release mechanism was another significant hurdle. My initial idea of incorporating a vacuum release within the base of the piston was ultimately flawed due to the potential for leakage, exacerbated by coffee grounds that could obstruct any flat sealing mechanism. We then explored the possibility of using a one-way Y ring seal on the portafilter. However, we later found that the tolerances in the manufacturing process for the portafilter and the main chamber across this large diameter meant that the sealing couldn't possibly work across a large set of gaps between these two parts. Testing showed that either the Y seal needed a pressure burst to seal, or if it was too large, it didn't release the vacuum until a much larger vacuum formed. Ultimately, we opted for a simple ring seal that is pushed down during the locking process and lifted during the unlocking process to release vacuum pressure. However, this solution is still awaiting validation through prototype testing. Another issue we encountered was with the lever arms, where the contact pressure to the arm bearing contact points and/or the arm thickness itself was potentially beyond the stainless steel's ultimate yield strength, leading to an observed bending of the J-curves over time. The solution was to use a softer metal racer over the bearings, which distributed the contact stress and to thicken the metal and widen the base. And we also changed to a super duplex hardened stainless. All these changes significantly strengthened the arms and solved the issue. And in testing, after hundreds of shots, the J-arm sections never bent by even the smallest amount. Another issue that came up in testing was when the hardened arms moved over the metal parts of the base. They had an abrasive effect, and hence over time they produced a staining slurry of oil and metal particles. So we had to prevent metal-to-metal contact between the arms and the base using soft plastic inserts in the base. Further, we'll need to polish the arms in the sections that contact these plastic inserts so that they don't wear down over time. Finally, the base design and look also took considerable effort. We found that the new force modification mechanism needed a bridge to stop the arms from wobbling when they were raised. We also put strong magnets in the side of the handle grips so that they clip together at the top and the action feels really nice. Implementing the pressure gauge was particularly challenging. Initially, I envisaged placing the gauge on a leg, which would require running a line from the piston to the leg and lots of plumbing bits. The solution also needed a spiral line that could lengthen and accommodate the moving piston. However, space constraints and the potential for bacterial buildup in the water lines would have required regular flushing. Ultimately, this made the design impractical, so we changed to a side position for the pressure gauge, which in the end made it easier to view anyway. So that was the journey. A ton of experimentation and a ton of trial and error. But I think the existing design is awesome and I'm really happy with it. We're presently in the final stages of quoting and a final round of design for manufacture. Hopefully there are not too many changes recommended by the manufacturer and we should be able to tool this up in the next few months. Last year around September, I was confident we could get these VFiPP plates out before Christmas. Boy was I wrong. We had a number of issues when designing this, mostly centered around the flow patterns within the plates, how to stop the stream of water from cutting the silicon, the micro manufacturing processes required for the buttons, and also how to keep the manufacturing costs down so that VFiPP plates weren't too expensive for people. Each VFiPP plate will come with 5 or so flow buttons with different flow apertures that will put different amounts of compressive force on the back of the puck. This level of control by the user is required, and the flow buttons will be chosen by the user. For example, a dark roast with a dose of 15 grams will require a much larger compressive force than say a 21 gram light roast. We also put these pull tabs on the top so you can pull the plate out of the basket easily enough. We are looking at a retraction tool, something like this, so you can rotate in place to pull the plate out, but I'm not sure this will work. I'll test it on the first samples that I get in the next couple of months. As an aside, the above findings were really relevant and really showed that VFiPP plates will have huge advantages for low dosing 58mm baskets, because at present a 15 gram dark roast is not possible to pull on a 58mm basket if the roast is somewhat degassed, as it simply runs too fast. In fact, some degassed dark roasts struggle to provide enough resistance even at 16 to 17 gram doses, even at the finest grind settings. And if we use these ultra-fine grind settings, we introduce a ton of bitterness in the cup. VFiPP fixes this by putting a compressive force on the puck, which locks in fines and allows for a coarser grind by reducing the bypass apertures we talked about, recovering shot times without resorting to fine grind, hence reducing bitterness. I've been using VFiPP plates for dark roasts for about 6 months now, and what I can tell you is that I've fallen back in love with dark roasts and the intense cherry flavor tasting notes and sweetness you get from them, as VFiPP plates boost acidity and cut down on bitterness. VFiPP now has so many advantages. We know about the lack of a dialing process. I expect the extraction yield to grind size curve is going to be very broad. There is also little need for distribution, as VFiPPs have an automatic puck healing capability, which we have shown previously. But now it's clear they allow for smaller dose shots and they cut down on bitterness at the end of the shot, which changes the game in terms of when you stop your shot. So VFiPPs could be a game changer for longer ratio shots. And if those advantages weren't enough, it also keeps your espresso machine completely clean, as it separates the grinds from the espresso machine water. However, I think we need the espresso community to explore the vast new espresso phase space VFiPP plates introduce. All rules will be out the window with VFiPP plates. Shot times, grind size, stop and start is also possible on shots. The only rule that might survive is the espresso ratio. The tools for VFiPP plates is being cut right now. Finally, let's look at a couple of other products and challenges. The adjustable scoop is awesome. I've been using it for a year now and I'm not going back to scales, especially when using VFiPPs, which are quite insensitive to dose. But we had this interesting problem of how to introduce a variable amount of friction to prevent the adjustable scoop thread from unscrewing and hence decalibrating the dose over time. Boy, this took over a year to solve, on and off of course. However, the final really neat solution was to use a looser thread and have people place the scoop in hot water to deform the top part into an oval so that it always has friction with the bottom part. And you need to press the sides together to make this part circular so that you can adjust it when switching beans and roasts. So I thought that was a really neat solution. Anyway, onto the day one container. Sadly, I'm not sure it is a viable product due to the availability of really low price single dose glass tubes on AliExpress. It's probably too expensive to manufacture, but we'll look at it later in 2025. Lastly, the tamper. You're not going to believe this, but I'm still changing the designs to this day. This thing has gone through almost 3 years of design changes. The latest is that we've now implemented this thread bolt and plate design over the magnetically retained pin. The tamper face is reversible, so you have a flat tamper and a curved tamper for curved bases like the IMS. But I'm even considering an actual reverse concave curvature for flat baskets like the Swordworks basket. Since after our results and Lance's results, I suspect a tiny concave curvature would actually help with extraction yield, but I'll need to build one and test it extensively. Anyway, that's it. We're moving ahead as fast as we can. It's really up to the contract manufacturer now, as we're really just waiting on samples to test. As soon as I get close to finalized samples, I'll be testing and sending them to various people for testing and feedback. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. I really appreciate it. Check out the new website and don't forget to subscribe to our mailing list, as stocks on initial products at launch may be limited. We're anticipating a JLever launch, hopefully before the end of the year, if not early next year. I'll see you in the next video.